She had not meant to start a war. She had only meant to free the children. The cages were hidden 3 miles into the Ashfen wood, draped in camouflage, netting, and stinking of iron and urine, and the particular kind of fear that only the very young produce when they have been kept in the dark too long. Maren counted 7 of them, 7 small bodies curled against the bars, 7 pairs of eyes that caught the moonlight like coins dropped into deep water. She was an omega, which meant she was nobody, which meant nobody would come looking if she disappeared into the woods after them. That was, she had always believed, the only reliable advantage her rank had ever given her. She could move without consequence. She could act without permission. She could free 7 pups from iron cages in the dead of a moonless night and be back in her borrowed bed in the border settlement before the poachers woke. What she had not planned for was the scent. What she had not planned for was him. She was Maren of no pack, omega-born and pack-rejected at 17, who had spent the following 4 years learning that invisibility was not the same as safety, and that silence was not the same as peace. She was 21 years old and she smelled like pine resin and river water, and the particular wildness of a wolf who had never been collared by anyone. And somewhere in the darkness between the cages and the tree line, the Alpha King's forward scouts had caught her trail, and the Alpha King himself, 7 feet of territorial fury wrapped in black tactical armor, had decided that the scent belonged to his mate. She did not know that yet. She was too busy running. The Ashfen Wood had been disputed territory for the better part of a decade, caught between the southern packs who claimed ancestral grazing rights and the northern mountain clans who claimed sovereign boundary rights, and both of them wrong, according to the border families who had actually lived there and mostly just wanted everyone to stop staging skirmishes through their cabbage fields. Maren had come to the border settlement 8 months ago with nothing but a worn pack on her back and a skill set that was, by any polite measure, unusual for an omega. She could track, she could set snares. She could read the signs that poachers left behind, the bent saplings, the disturbed earth, the particular silence that fell over a stretch of forest when something had been hurting things in it for a while. She had found the cage signs 3 weeks before she acted on them. She had been patient. That was the second advantage her rank had given her. Nobody expected patience from an omega, so nobody thought to guard against it. The 7th pup was the problem. The others had been frightened but mobile, clinging to her neck and her clothing and each other as she guided them through the cage doors with hands that did not shake because she refused to let them. The 7th was a girl, perhaps 5 years old, with dark copper hair and a badly set bone in her left forearm that had been broken and left to mend wrong. She could not walk quickly. She would not be carried by a stranger, not at first, and Maren had understood that, had made herself sit very still in the mud outside the cage door for 3 long minutes while the sounds of the poacher camp shifted and resettled, had offered her hand palm up in the way she had once seen a pack mother do for a frightened pup, had waited until the small fingers closed around hers. They were 1 mile into the tree line when the howl went up behind them. It was not the howl of a wolf. It was the howl of a furious human man who had found his cages empty and his cargo gone. And it was followed immediately by the sound of dogs, the human kind, trained trackers, baying into the dark. Maren felt the pups press close against her legs. She counted them by touch in the darkness. 7, still 7. She picked up the copper-haired girl without asking permission this time, settled her against her hip, and ran. She ran the way omegas learn to run when no one is coming to help them. Low and fast and without wasted motion, her feet finding the soft earth between the tree roots, her breathing controlled, her mind 3 steps ahead of her body. She had mapped this section of the Ashfen Wood on foot over 8 months of solitary walks. She knew where the stream bent east and where the ground softened into marsh and where the old lightning-struck oak stood that marked the unofficial edge of settlement territory, the place beyond which the poachers had, so far, not pushed. If she could reach that oak, the pups were brave. That was the thing she would remember later, in the quiet moments, the thing that tightened her chest and made her press her lips together and breathe through her nose until the feeling passed. They were 5 years old and 4 years old and perhaps 6, and they were running through a dark forest with a stranger, and not one of them made a sound. She did not hear the Alpha King's army until she nearly ran into the forward scout. He was a massive shape in the dark, broad-shouldered and suddenly present, and Maren reacted before she thought, shifted the girl to her other hip, planted her feet, and put herself between the shape and the 7 pups with all the effectiveness of a sparrow planting itself between a hawk and a hen house. She knew it was futile. She did not move. "Back up," she said quietly. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. The shape did not back up, but it also did not advance. It stood very still in the way that large, powerful things sometimes stood very still when they were, and this was the word she reached for later, trying to make sense of it, startled. Then a second shape appeared, and a third, and they were all large, all in black, all carrying the kind of controlled stillness that spoke of military training and hierarchical discipline. And between them appeared the largest shape of all, and Maren understood, in the slow and terrible way that understanding sometimes arrived, that she had run directly into the Alpha King's forward column. King Kale of the Northern Mountain Clans stood in the darkness of the Ashfin Wood and looked at the Omega woman who had placed herself between his scouts and 7 cage-thin children with the absolute physical certainty of someone who was not going to move, and felt the mate bond hit him like a fist to the sternum. It was not gentle. It was not romantic. It was a seismic event, a restructuring. Every wolf instinct he had ever developed in 34 years of life and 15 of ruling, suddenly reorienting around a single fixed point. And that point was her, the pine resin and river water and wild, uncollared freedom of her, the way she was breathing, the way her feet were planted, the way she was looking at him with eyes that held no deference and no fear, only a kind of ferocious, focused intention, as though she had already calculated the odds and decided they didn't apply to her. He said nothing for a long moment. Neither did she. One of the pups, a small boy with mud on his face and someone else's blood on his shirt, looked between Maren and the Alpha King and whispered, very quietly, "Is that a giant?" "Yes," Maren said, without taking her eyes off Kale. "But we're not afraid of giants, are we?" "No," the boy whispered, though he moved slightly closer to her leg. Kale cleared his throat. He had given thousands of orders in 15 years of rule. He had addressed councils and courts and battle formations and foreign dignitaries. He was, by any available metric, not a man who struggled to speak. "You freed those pups," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "From the heron poachers?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Evidently." He looked at her for another moment. In the darkness, she could not fully read his expression, but something in his posture had changed. The battle-ready tension had shifted into something else, something that his scouts, all 3 of them highly experienced men who had served him for over a decade, had never once seen on their king's face, and so none of them had a name for it yet. "You're an Omega," he said. The way she looked at him then. "Yes," she said. "And you've got about 45 seconds before those tracking dogs pick up the trail again. So if you're planning to do something useful with your army, Your Majesty, now would be the time." Kale blinked. Then, slowly, against everything in him, his mouth curved. Just slightly. Just enough. He turned and lifted 2 fingers, and the column behind him moved with the smooth, terrible efficiency of a war machine that had been waiting for exactly this signal. She had not started a war, but she had, without knowing it, just walked into the middle of one. The 12 days that followed were the strangest of Maren's life, and her life had not been short on strangeness. The Alpha King's forward camp was set 2 miles north of the lightning-struck oak, a cluster of matte black structures half hidden by the canopy, efficient and temporary in the way of things built by people who were always prepared to leave. The pups were taken gently, she would admit, more gently than she had feared, to the camp's medical station, where a pack healer with tired eyes and efficient hands examined them all, reset the copper-haired girl's arm properly, and gave them food and warmth and the kind of quiet, firm reassurance that well-trained healers gave frightened children. Maren stayed with them until they slept. She expected, when she finally emerged, to be processed, questioned, possibly detained. She was a lone Omega who had been found running through disputed territory in the company of 7 uncollared pups in the middle of the night. She had no pack affiliation. She had no documentation of the kind that border settlements were technically required to produce when challenged by sovereign military presence. She had nothing except the clothes she was wearing and the small knife she wore at her hip, which she expected to be confiscated and wasn't. What she did not expect was to be escorted, politely but without option, to the command tent and offered a chair and a cup of tea. King Kale was already there, seated behind a map table that he had clearly been working at for some time before her arrival. There were notations in what looked like at least 3 different inks, and a tactical overlay that she recognized, with a small, startled pulse, as a hand-drawn map of the Ashfin wood that was considerably more accurate than anything the border settlement possessed. He had removed the black tactical armor. In its place, he wore a heavy, dark shirt and campaign trousers, and in the lamplight, he looked less like a tactical asset and more like a man, which she found slightly harder to manage. He watched her look at the map. He did not tell her to stop. "You've been in the Ashfin wood for 8 months, he said. It was not a question. "Yes. You mapped this section." He touched a particular area of the overlay, the exact section where the marsh bent west, and the old drainage channels from the former mill created a series of natural choke points that she had spent 6 weeks identifying. The drainage channels, most of our scouts missed them. She sat down in the chair because her feet hurt and because there was no tactical value in remaining standing. "Your scouts are mapping from the north," she said. "Those channels only read clearly from the south, at ground level, in spring when the water table's high." He looked at her steadily. In the lamplight, she could see his face properly for the first time. And it was. She took the observation and filed it away with the discipline of someone who had learned early that dwelling on things you couldn't have was a luxury rank, hadn't given her a severe face. All bone structure and stillness, with eyes that were a deep, unusual amber, and currently fixed on her with an attention that was slightly difficult to sustain. He was, by any objective measure, very beautiful in the way that carved things were beautiful, hard-edged and permanent, and not designed for comfort. "What pack?" he asked. "None." Something moved across his face. "You were ejected." "I was released," she said, and heard the precision in her own voice, and did not apologize for it. Released was the word she had chosen for what had happened, when the pack Alpha at 17 had looked at her and said, "You are an Omega and we are a fighting pack, and I cannot justify the allocation of resources." And she had picked up her things and walked out and not looked back, because looking back was the second luxury her rank hadn't given her. Kale was quiet for a moment. "The pups," he said. "None of them are from your settlement." "No. They're from 3 different packs, as far as I can tell from their markings. The heron poachers sell to collectors in the southern territories. Young uncollared wolves, still partially in shift, carry a significant premium." She heard her own voice giving him information she had compiled over weeks of careful, invisible observation and thought, somewhere below the calculation, he is listening. He is actually listening to every word. The operation's been running for at least a season. There are 2 more cache sites I identified but couldn't reach alone. He leaned forward slightly. "Just slightly. Show me." She showed him. She spread the map between them and traced the routes with her finger, and he listened and asked questions that told her, with a precision that she respected despite herself, that he understood terrain and tactics and the particular economy of criminal enterprise. And the tent was warm, and the tea had gone cold, and somewhere outside the camp, the Ashfin wood was breathing its slow, dark breath, and she thought, "This is the strangest night of my life, and it is not yet over." It got stranger. His second-in-command, a compact man named Ren, who had the look of someone who processed information as a physical reflex, appeared at the tent entrance and said, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he wasn't sure how to deliver, "The pack representatives from the southern border are arriving at first light, sir. They're demanding jurisdiction over the rescue." Kale did not look away from the map. Jurisdiction over what, precisely? "Over the pups, sir." And over Ren's gaze moved, briefly, to Maren. "Over anyone present during the action." "Anyone present?" Kale repeated. "Yes, sir." "She is not under southern jurisdiction." Ren paused. "She's not under northern jurisdiction either, sir. She is under my protection," Kale said. And the words came out flat and absolute, the way words did when they were not arguable. and the tent was suddenly very quiet. That is sufficient jurisdiction for the moment. Thank you, Wren. Wren left. Maren looked at the Alpha King. The Alpha King looked at the map. You didn't need to do that, she said. No, he agreed. I am capable of managing my own. I am aware of your capabilities, he said. I watched you plant yourself between 7 children and 3 of my scouts with nothing but a 3-inch blade and absolute certainty. He finally looked up. Those amber eyes found hers with an accuracy that felt, she thought, almost physical. I did not say you needed protection. I said you were under it. Those are different statements. She held his gaze for a long moment. I don't know what you want from me, she said, and meant it as a practical assessment. She had spent 4 years reading situations and people, and she could not read this one, could not find the angle, the calculation, the thing she was supposed to provide in exchange for whatever this was. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite expression, and not quite its absence. Something in between, something she might have called restraint if she'd trusted her own reading. I know, he said. Go sleep. The children will be safe. She went. She lay on the narrow cot they gave her and stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the camp settle into its night rhythms and thought about amber eyes and flat, absolute words, and did not sleep until nearly dawn. The Southern Pack representatives arrived at first light as promised. 4 of them, led by a broad man with a gray-streaked beard named Aldrich, who had the look of someone accustomed to having his authority treated as a gravitational force. He took one look at the camp and at Wren and at the careful, efficient way everything was organized, and said, Where are the pups? In the tone of a man who expected the answer immediately. He got it. He also got, over the following 2 hours, a very precise lesson in what it looked like when someone of significantly greater gravitational force disagreed with you. Maren watched from the edge of the medical station, where she had gone to sit with the copper-haired girl whose name she had learned was Brissette, and who had decided overnight with the categorical certainty of the very young that Maren was not leaving her sight, and where she had a clear line of view to the command tent without being obviously positioned to observe it. Aldrich's delegation emerged looking significantly flatter than they'd arrived. Wren appeared at her elbow 20 minutes later. The king requests your presence, he said, and then, in a tone that was not quite conversational but was making an effort, the Southern delegation has agreed to coordinate through the Northern Command on the Poacher operation. The 2 cache sites you identified will be raided at nightfall. Both at once? Simultaneously to prevent transfer. She nodded slowly. The eastern cache will need someone who knows the drainage channel's approach. The Heron scouts will hear a standard ground approach before it's within effective range. Wren looked at her. Yes, he said, that's the current problem. I can lead the eastern approach. Another pause. Longer. You should probably tell the king that. She set Brissette gently down, secured the child's grip on the healer's sleeve with the practiced ease of someone who had done a lot of transition management for frightened small people, and went to tell the king. Cale said no. He said it with less of his face than she was coming to understand, was his usual register, which meant it was a no he had feelings about. She stood across the map table from him and laid out her case in the even, methodical way she had learned to present arguments in a world that gave her no automatic credibility, and he listened to all of it. And then said no again. I'm the only one in this camp who has been to that location, she said. You can describe it. A description isn't the same as a guide. You are not trained for tactical operations. She looked at him steadily. I freed 7 pups from a poacher camp alone, at night, without tactical training. That, he said, is exactly why I'm saying no. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Something compressed and controlled. And she had spent enough time learning to read things that were compressed and controlled to understand that the compression was not coldness. What you did was extraordinary, and it was also, he stopped. You were not safe. I was safe enough. You were one howl from capture. And yet, here I am. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber eyes held something she still could not fully name. Something that was becoming a fixture of their exchanges, this thing that sat between them like a third presence. if I send scouts with you, he said finally, if you lead and the scouts maintain formation around you, if you give me your word that you follow their tactical calls on anything that requires force. She understood that this was a concession of significant size for a man who had not previously, by any available evidence, negotiated his operational decisions with lone, uncollared Omegas. Agreed, she said. And you tell me, he said, with a quietness that changed the register entirely, why you were in those woods alone to begin with. What made you look for the cages in the first place? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the tent, the camp was moving through its mid-morning operations, measured and efficient. Brissette had started. She could hear a determined one-sided argument with the healer about whether her arm splint needed to be quite that tight. I was packless at 17, she said. I've been moving between border settlements for 4 years. The Ashvin settlement took me in for the winter, and then spring came and I stayed. She paused. 2 months ago, a pup from the settlement went missing, 8 years old. We found him eventually. He'd wandered too far east and gotten turned around. Nothing worse than that. But for 6 hours, I didn't know that. And during those 6 hours, I started thinking about what happened to the ones who didn't wander back. Cale was very still. So I started looking, she said, and I found what I found. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. The pup from the settlement. He was yours? No, I don't have. She stopped. No, but he knew me. He used to bring me things he found in the woods, interesting rocks. A feather once that he was convinced had fallen off something magical. She heard her own voice and pressed her lips together briefly. He's fine. He's home. I just wanted to make sure the others were too. Cale looked at her. Just looked. And the thing between them, the third presence, settled into something heavier and warmer and more specifically weighted than it had been before. And Maren thought, with the part of her mind that was always watching and calculating, I am in significant trouble. Go, he said. Get your route notes. Briefing is at 14th hour. She went. She told herself very firmly, absolutely fine. She was not absolutely fine. The briefing at 14th hour revealed the full shape of what the Alpha King had organized in the space of a morning, and it was she sat at the edge of the briefing formation and watched it unfold and thought, with the particular sensation of someone who has spent years operating on minimal resources, that this was what it looked like when power was applied with precision instead of blunt force. 40 scouts. 2 simultaneous columns. Communication protocols that she had to admit were more elegant than anything she'd worked out alone. And at the center of it, Cale, moving between the elements of the plan with the ease of someone who thought in systems, who saw the shape of things whole. He caught her eye once, across the breadth of the briefing space, and she looked away first. She hated that she'd looked away first. She spent the rest of the briefing looking directly at the maps and not at anything else. The raid went, to her cautious astonishment, almost exactly as planned. The eastern cache was in a low stone structure, half buried in the hillside, accessible only through the drainage channel approach that her weeks of mapping had identified. She led the eastern column through the channels with the pre-dawn mist rising off the water and the scouts moving in the careful silence of highly trained people who had been told to follow her lead and were, she could feel it, reservedly skeptical and becoming less so by degrees. They emerged from the channel mouth into a clearing that the poachers had not thought to guard on its eastern face, because no one who didn't know the channels existed would approach from that direction. The scouts deployed around the structure with a smooth, automatic efficiency that she stepped back to allow, and then stood in the clearing and listened to the Ashvin wood and counted her breaths. 4 pups in the eastern cache, 2 from the northern mountain packs, 1 from a southern border clan, 1 whose markings she didn't recognize at all alive, all frightened. All within the space of the following 10 minutes. Out of the cages and in the arms of the scouts, who turned out this surprised her, and then didn't to handle the children with the same quiet competence they brought to everything else. Wren's voice on the communication channel, crisp and factual. Western cache secured. 3 pups, unharmed. Poacher camp neutralized. A pause. Eastern? Secured, said the scout commander beside her. 4 pups, no casualties. Another pause. The Omega's route was exact. She heard the silence that followed that, and thought she probably understood what it contained. They brought the pups back to camp in the gray early morning, 11 children now instead of 7, and Brisset was waiting at the camp perimeter with the healer's hand firmly in her own, and broke free the moment she saw Maren and wrapped both arms around Maren's waist with the unself-conscious force of the very young. And Maren stood in the gray light and held on and thought, this is what it costs to be seen, and it is possibly worth it, and I don't know what to do with that. Kale appeared from the command tent's direction. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her holding the girl, and at the scouts moving the new pups toward the medical station, and at the gray light beginning to warm at its edges, and his face was doing the thing again, the compressed and controlled thing that was not coldness, and she looked at him and thought, I am running out of ways to explain you to myself. The next 3 days were the problem. The pups' families arrived to collect them over the course of those 3 days, in 1s and 2s and small delegations, and each reunion was a thing that Maren watched from a careful distance and felt in a place below her ribs that she had spent 4 years learning to insulate and apparently had not insulated well enough. She helped manage the logistics, the identification of pup to family, the documentation that the Alpha King's people produced with considerable efficiency, the navigation of the complicated business of Southern pack parents meeting Northern Mountain Clan scouts, and everyone being too grateful and too relieved to be territorial about it. She was useful. She was practically useful, which was the only kind she had ever let herself be. And it kept her hands occupied and her mind organized and worked reasonably well, right up until the afternoon of the 3rd day when Brissette's family arrived. Brissette's mother was a young woman with the same copper hair and the same particular quality of stillness, broken at the moment of seeing her daughter into a sound that Maren had no category for. A sound that was not a word and not quite a cry, and that came from somewhere below language. She gathered her daughter against her and stayed that way for a long time, on her knees in the dirt of the camp, with her eyes closed, and her daughter held like something she would not put down again. Maren watched from the supply tent's shadow and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed carefully. She'll be safe now. Kale's voice behind her. She had not heard him approach, which said something about her current state of distraction that she did not care to examine. She didn't turn around. Yes, she said. The arm will heal properly. The healer says she's young enough. Good. He was quiet. She could feel his presence behind her with a specificity that was, she was coming to understand, not attributable to his size or his rank or the quality of military authority he carried. It was something else. Something that had been building since the moment in the dark forest when he had looked at her and gone still, and that she had been refusing to name for 10 days with the focused determination of someone who knew exactly what she was refusing and why. You're going to leave, he said. It was not quite a question. The settlement, she began, is managed without you. Has been for the days you've been here. He paused. I'm not trying to trap you in an argument. I'm trying to... Another pause. Longer. She had the sense, for the first time, of him searching for words, which was not the impression he normally conveyed. I am trying to say something, and I don't. He stopped completely. She turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, and the amber eyes were doing something she had no precedent for, something that was not the controlled assessment of the briefing tent or the flat authority of the command decisions. Something that was open was the word that arrived, careful and open in the way of something that did not often permit itself to be. What? She said, very quietly. I have ruled for 15 years, he said. I have made thousands of decisions in those 15 years, and I have been certain of most of them and wrong about some of them, and I have never, he exhaled slowly, I have never met anyone who walked into my scouts with a 3-inch knife and told me to be useful. Something in his face moved. I have never wanted anyone to stay before. She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the camp moved through its afternoon rhythms, unhurried, and Brisette and her mother were a small, still shape at the camp's center, and the Ashfin wood breathed its slow breath at the edges of everything. I am an Omega, she said. Not defensively, just factually. The way she had learned to state facts that people preferred to use against her. Packless, undocumented. I have nothing to offer. How could I not want you? The words came out with a quietness that was somehow larger than volume. How could I look at what you did alone, at night, for children you had no obligation to? With nothing but a 3-inch knife and 8 months of solitary preparation, and how could I not? He stopped, steadied himself. My wolf recognized you in the dark before I could see your face. I have been told what that means my entire life. I didn't believe it would feel like this. She was very still. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was not. She told herself firmly, going to cry in the middle of an Alpha King's military camp in front of 40 scouts and 11 reuniting families and the entire Ashfen Wood. You're telling me, she said, and her voice was remarkably steady, she thought, that you're claiming a mate bond. I am not claiming anything, he said, and the distinction in his voice was precise and intentional. I am telling you what I feel, what I want, what my wolf has known since the moment in the trees. His gaze held hers. What you do with that information is entirely yours. She looked at him. She looked at the amber eyes that had been watching her with that careful, unguarded attention for 10 days, and at the face that was severe and permanent and not designed for comfort, and at the way he was standing, which was the way, she realized, of a man who was not at all certain of the outcome and was remaining where he was anyway. I need time, she said. Yes, he said, not disappointed, not pressing, just present. Take it. She took it. She took 4 more days, which she spent in the ordinary useful business of helping to manage the last of the family reunions and compile the documentation on the dismantled poacher operation that would be submitted to the Border Council, and teaching 3 of Kale Scouts the drainage channel approach so it could be incorporated into the permanent patrol route. She was useful. She was practically useful. And in the spaces between useful things, she walked to the edge of the tree line and looked at the Ashfen Wood and let herself think, fully and without insulation, about what an Alpha King who waited, who asked questions and then listened to the answers, who said, what I do with that information is entirely yours, what that meant, and what she wanted it to mean, and whether wanting was something she was allowed. It was Brissette who settled it, with the categorical decisiveness of a 5-year-old who had decided how things should be. On the 4th day, an hour before Brissette's mother was due to take her home, the copper-haired girl came to find Maren at the supply tent where she was working, and stood in the entrance with her splinted arm at her side, and her expression very serious. Are you coming with us? She asked. No, Maren said. I'm glad you're going home, though, with your mama. Brissette considered this. Are you staying here? With the giant? Maren felt something shift in her chest. A slow, seismic settling, like ground finding its level after a long disturbance. I don't know yet, she said. Brissette looked at her with the unsentimental certainty of the very young. You should stay, she said. He looks at you like my papa looks at my mama. She paused, apparently considering whether more evidence was required. All the time, even when you're not watching. She went back to her mother. Maren sat in the supply tent and looked at the canvas wall and breathed. Then she stood up and went to find the Alpha King. He was at the map table. He was, as far as she could tell, always at the map table. When he wasn't actively doing something else, it seemed to be where his mind went when his hands needed occupation, spreading the terrain out before him and looking at it until it gave up its patterns. He looked up when she entered, and his expression went through something brief and complicated, and settled into the careful openness she had come to recognize. She stood across the table from him and said, I need you to understand something before this goes any further. All right, he said. I left a pack at 17 because they decided I wasn't worth the resources. I have spent 4 years being told, in various ways, by various people, that my rank means I have nothing to offer. I have built myself into someone who is not going to accept that assessment. She held his gaze. I am not a kept omega. I am not going to sit in a court somewhere and be decorative and approved of and managed. If this she indicated the space between them. If this is going where I think it might be going, You need to understand that I come with opinions and arguments, and I will lead eastern columns through drainage channels at 3 a.m. if I decide it needs doing. Kale looked at her steadily throughout this. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I sent 40 trained scouts into disputed territory last week, and the decisive element of the operation was your 8 months of solitary preparation. A pause. I am aware of what you offer. I was aware before I knew your name. His voice was quiet and precise, and the amber eyes were very direct. I don't want a kept Omega. I have never in my life wanted something that would allow itself to be kept. She breathed. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. I'm telling you yes, she said. I'm telling you I know what the mate bond means, and I've spent 4 days deciding that I want it. That I want. Her voice did something small, and she steadied it. I want to stay. I want whatever this is. I want to stop moving. She paused. That last one I'm saying for the first time, just so you know. He came around the table. He moved with the same controlled deliberateness he brought to everything, and stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and raised one hand to the side of her face, not grasping, not directing, just present, resting against her jaw with a gentleness that was somehow the most precise thing she had ever felt from another person. Maren, he said. Her name in his mouth was strange and right in equal measure. I have not been warm in my life. I have been told so, by people who tried to make it into a wound. His thumb moved slightly against her cheekbone. You walked out of the dark holding 7 children and told me to be useful. You argued with me about eastern columns. A pause, and something in his face that was undoing itself, slowly, layer by layer. You made me want to be warm again. She pressed her hand against his chest. She felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and felt her own wolf settle into alignment with it the way compasses settle to north, not dramatically, not with the electric shock of stories, but with a deep, certain, bone-level recognition of having found the direction you were always supposed to be facing. She kissed him first. She would remember that later and be glad of it that it had been her choice, made freely, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. He responded with the same careful, absolute attention he brought to everything, both hands now at her face, the kiss unhurried and thorough and warm in the way she had not let herself hope for, the mate bond clicking into place between them with the quiet permanence of something that had always been true. The tent was warm, and the camp moved through its evening rhythms outside, and when they finally separated, there was a quality of stillness between them that was not absence but presence, not silence but completion. The court, she said, after a moment. They're going to have opinions. Yes, he agreed. There was the curve at the corner of his mouth again, the one she had first seen in the dark forest, the one that meant something was amusing him at depth. They are going to have many opinions. At volume. I'm a packless Omega with a 3-inch knife. You are the woman who freed 11 children from poachers without assistance, and then walked into my forward column and told me to be useful. His thumb traced her cheekbone again. I cannot imagine the court has opinions I'll find more compelling than that. She thought about this. She thought about council chambers and formal presentations and the particular challenge of existing in a space designed to minimize what she was. With a mate at her side who was beginning to understand that her rank had never been the limit they'd told her it was, she thought about 11 children going home to their families. She thought about Brissette's copper hair and her decisive 5-year-old wisdom and the way she had said all the time, even when you're not watching. Then I suppose we should go deal with them, she said. We will, he said. Tomorrow, tonight. He paused. Tonight you should eat and rest and let the bond settle. That's very practical of you. I have my moments. She laughed, and it surprised her the fullness of it, uncalculated, arriving before she could manage it into something more controlled. She heard it fill the tent and thought, this is what warmth sounds like when you've been cold for a long time. This is what it sounds like when something held too tight is finally released. He looked at her when she laughed with an expression that was no longer compressed or controlled or restrained in any way. An expression that was simply and entirely open, and she thought, he has not heard many people laugh in this tent. She thought, I'm going to remedy that, systematically and over time. The days that followed moved in a new rhythm. The camp broke after another week, the operation formally documented and submitted. The Poacher Network's remaining nodes flagged for follow-up coordination between the northern and southern authorities, in a joint agreement that Aldrich signed with the aggrieved face of a man who had arrived expecting to dominate a situation, and left having agreed to share it. The 11 pups were all home. The Ashfin Wood was quiet, in the particular way of a place that has been troubled, and is now, cautiously, beginning to settle. Maren rode north with the column. She had her worn pack and her 3-inch knife, and the new weight of the mate bond settled across her shoulders like a mantle she was still learning the shape of. She rode beside Kale, because he had placed her there and she had allowed it, and the scouts rode in formation around them and said nothing, which she had come to understand was its own kind of speech. The court of the Northern Mountain clans was everything she had anticipated, and several things she hadn't. It occupied a structure that was old in the way of things built to outlast the people who built them. All dark stone and high ceilings, and the accumulated weight of generations of authority. The people in it looked at her with expressions that ranged from carefully neutral to openly hostile, and she stood in the entrance hall in her border settlement clothes, with her worn pack over one shoulder, and met every gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who had been invisible for 4 years and had decided she was finished with it. She heard what they said. She heard the word Omega carry across marble floors with a precision that acoustic spaces were occasionally unkind enough to provide. She heard the phrase no pack affiliation and the phrase unsuitable precedent, and from one older woman in council robes who was either very brave or very foolish, the phrase, he has simply lost his mind. Kale, beside her, heard all of it too. He turned to face the room not with anger, not with the cold authority of a king managing a problem, but with something that was more fundamental than either, something that was simply true and simply his, and simply not negotiable. He spoke into the assembled quiet of the entrance hall with a carrying, level voice and said, "This woman walked alone into the Ashfin Wood at midnight and freed 11 children from poacher cages with a 3-inch knife and 4 years of preparation that she undertook without assistance, without resources, and without any expectation that anyone would recognize it. She then led a coordinated military column through terrain that my own scouts had failed to map accurately. She argued with me about operational decisions. A pause. She was right. Another pause, and his voice shifted into something quieter and more absolute. She is my mate and my equal, and she will be received as both. Anyone who finds that arrangement insufficiently traditional is welcome to take it up with me directly." The entrance hall was very quiet. Ren, positioned 2 steps behind and to the right, had the expression of a man exercising significant restraint on the subject of how exactly he felt about this moment. Maren looked at the Alpha King standing in his entrance hall publicly and irrevocably declaring something that his court had not asked for and would not be consulted on, and felt the mate bond settle another degree deeper. Warm and permanent in hers, she thought about a packmaster who had said, "I cannot justify the allocation of resources." She thought about 4 years of moving between settlements, of being useful in the only ways she'd been permitted. She thought about a small boy bringing her interesting rocks and a feather from something magical. She thought, I have been allocating my own resources all along. I simply needed somewhere permanent to apply them. She straightened her shoulders. She turned to the assembled court and said, with the clear, even voice she had developed over 4 years of making herself understood by people who preferred not to listen, "I understand there will be a council session on the jurisdiction agreement with the Southern Packs. I have documentation on the remaining Heron Network nodes that should be incorporated into the agenda. I'd like to be present for that discussion." She paused. "I also have suggestions regarding the patrol integration for the Ashfin Woods eastern drainage system that I think would significantly improve response time on the border. If someone could direct me to whoever manages the patrol schedules, I'd appreciate it." The silence continued. Then one of the younger council members, she would come to know him as Devon, who was efficient and practical and consistently one of her better allies in the years to come, produced a tablet and said, "Carefully, I manage the patrol schedules, my lady." My lady. She filed that away. She thought it would require some recalibration over time, but she was patient. She had always been patient. "Excellent," she said. "When is convenient?" Kale made a sound beside her. It was very quiet, and she recognized it now. She had heard it once before, in a command tent with a cold cup of tea between them, the first time she had surprised him. It was, she understood, the sound he made when something moved him too quickly for his control to intercept it. She did not look at him. She was busy looking at Devon and beginning the considerable work of making herself indispensable to a northern mountain court that did not yet know it needed her. But she felt his hand at the small of her back warm and present and certain, and she let herself lean into it, just barely, just enough that only he would feel it. The court adjusted, as courts do when confronted with something that is both inevitable and well organized. It took months and not moments, and there were arguments she won and ones she didn't, and there were people who came around slowly and people who never quite did, and there were nights when the weight of the court's resistance sat on her chest like something physical, and Kale would find her at the window looking out over the mountain, dark, and sit beside her without speaking until she was ready to speak, and she would say whatever it was that needed saying, and he would listen, and that would be enough. She thought sometimes about the word omega and what it had meant in every context she'd lived inside the limiting, the releasing, the allocating away of. She thought about what it meant now, here, in a court that was slowly, grudgingly, then genuinely learning to recognize what she was. She thought it meant something different in every mouth that had ever said it, and the only meaning that had ever been true was the one she had carried herself, that she was someone who moved without consequence, who acted without permission, who could free 7 pups from iron cages and lead columns through drainage channels and stand in an entrance hall with a worn pack and a 3-inch knife and not be diminished by any of it. Brissett sent a drawing, 3 months later, delivered in an envelope addressed in a child's careful hand to the Omega lady at the Northern Mountain Court. It was a picture in red and brown crayon of a very small figure and a very large figure standing in what might have been a forest or might have been a collection of vertical brown lines, with something above them that was either stars or determined scribbles. Maren kept it on the map table, weighted down with a smooth stone because Brisset's mother had included a note explaining that Brisset had chosen the stone specifically, that it was interesting, that she had been convinced it had fallen from something magical. Kale looked at the drawing and looked at Maren and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, the form his fullest feeling took, not silence as absence, but silence as the space where words would be insufficient. She pressed her hand against his chest the way she had done in the command tent the day she'd told him yes, and felt his heartbeat beneath it and thought, I stopped moving. I am staying. I am here in the only place I have ever chosen rather than arrived at by default, with a man who listened before he led and who stood in an entrance hall full of people with opinions and said, she is my equal, in a voice that was not arguable. And I am going to spend a very long time being exactly as useful as I choose to be. The Ashfen Wood stood quiet on its southern border, its old lightning-struck oak marking the place where everything had turned, its drainage channels known now and mapped and patrolled, its silence, the settled silence of a place where something that had been wrong for a long time had been finally and completely set right.